Hey everyone, I just wanted to quickly warn you about the audio quality of the episode on my side because for some reason my microphone wasn't working on the day of the interview with Rose and Paul. Luckily I fixed the issue, but the audio on my side is not as high quality as it usually is, so sorry about that. But I think the conversation that I had with Rose and Paul is still really interesting, so I hope that doesn't detract from the overall quality of the conversation. And so if you end up enjoying the interview or find the content that I make important, you can pitch into my efforts starting at $3 a month on patreon.com/theblockchainsocialist to help me out and join the newest patrons like Richard, Niels, John, Adam, Danielle, and Dan. Any amount really helps since making this stuff isn't free in terms of money or time. And as a patron, you'll get a shout out on an episode like I just did and access to bonus content like the most recent episode where I spoke to a couple of members of the crypto leftist community to hear more about what their experience was like being at ETH Denver. Of course, I'll still make free content like this interview to help spread the message that blockchain does not need to be used to further entrench capitalist exploitation if we put our efforts into it. And so if that message resonates with you, I hope you'll consider helping out. So thanks for giving this a listen, and let's get to the interview with Rose and Paul, who have recently started the first dedicated journal to agorism in the 21st century.
Agorism, agoric, I've also heard. All these terms you may have seen while perusing the wild west of the internet, especially among groups that are related to cryptocurrency. But when this term is sort of used, it can sometimes be a bit confusing on what it actually is and like what it actually means, what type of politics does it actually come from. And so what's really interesting is that in the past month or so, there has been a new journal published called Agorism in the 21st Century. And so I've brought here today both Paul and Rose, who have been working on the Agorist journal as a way to bring sort of politics back into cryptocurrency and to think about sort of the political roots of where cryptocurrency possibly comes from or could maybe be possibly take from. To start off, maybe if you guys just each of you want to give a quick introduction to yourselves and talk about a bit where the idea of the journal came about.
I'll go first. So I'm Dr. Paul Dylan-Ennis. I'm a lecturer in College of Business, University College Dublin, where I teach cryptocurrencies and have been doing so since around 2015, 2016. I'm a board member of the Association of Cryptocurrency Journalists and Researchers. Although I like to say at the same time, more importantly, I'm just an active member of the cryptocurrency and Web3 community, and I'm one of the editors of the journal.
So I'm Rose. My full name is Rachel Rose O'Leary, and I'm one of the kind of core developers of a anonymity project called DarkFi, which is trying to create like a permissionless network for anonymous smart contracts and programmable applications. And yeah, as a background, I've been in crypto for a good few years. I used to work at CoinDesk, and then I stopped writing in like 2018, 2019 when I went to Rojava, Syria. And then I came back and became a programmer, and I've been working on DarkFi since then. And I'm also co-editor of the journal with Paul and another friend who unfortunately couldn't join today. And the journal came into being through discussions between myself and Paul a couple of years ago now. I think it would have been maybe early 2020 when we first discussed the idea of a journal. And my recollection is that it came into being because myself and Amir we did a phone call with Paul where we said to him, you know, Amir has these ideas he wants to put together into like a manifesto or like a book. At the time he was talking about writing a book.
And Amir is Amir Taki, who I had on a while back while we were in Lisbon. to talk
Yes.
about DarkFi.
Yes, exactly. So we worked together on DarkFi, and so he had wanted to write a book. And when we presented this to Paul, Paul said, "Why not make it into a journal?" And he made a very good argument for why it would be better presented in a kind of journal format. And Paul, he could talk about this himself, but he has a lot of experiences in working in kind of building philosophy subcultures. So he drew on those experiences and proposed that we do a journal format. And sometime not long after that, the idea was proposed to have the kind of ideological bedrock of the journal be agorism. And I believe this was also a suggestion made by Paul, responding to some maybe some writing or some text that we'd made, myself and Amir, where he saw the links between the agorist philosophy, and he said this is a strategic kind of alliance of ideas. So agorism, I think, is an incredibly important kind of choice to have as the direction of the journal, because it's a way for us to speak to the philosophical origin story of crypto, and in that way, kind of galvanize its more radical elements. So I'll pass back to Paul in case you have something to add there.
Yeah, I think one of the things that really interests me in, let's say, early cryptocurrency culture, especially you'll notice this if you're teaching or you need to introduce people, you can start off with Bitcoin with a very clear conceptual historical narrative. You can say Bitcoin originates in a combination of cypherpunk culture, which is all this infrastructural mutualism. That's the fancy academic way that it's called. Also crypto anarchists, which in the literature is called digital metalism. So there is a clear story where this combination of political positions comes together out of a sequence of events where everything just clicks and it just seems to happen to work. Open source culture meets full-blown deregulationist market-oriented people, and they make this money happen. But then over the years, it sort of drifts and it becomes much harder, especially if you're trying to introduce what Ethereum is. So this is something I'm particularly interested in, the fact that Ethereum doesn't have an obvious and clear political philosophy. It has elements, it has like sort of emerging bubbling elements like Solarpunk and so on. But I'm never 100% clear, let's say, what the end game of Ethereum is from a political sense. So I've always been fascinated by that, the drift and the sort of softening of the radical origination of Bitcoin, and then how it just gets lost in a sort of haze. And even the Bitcoiners today, they seem to be drifting more into something like an alt-right populism. They're interested in increasingly, I would say, generic populist stuff. Like Jordan Peterson is the headline speaker at Bitcoin 2022.
So crazy.
So which I think is just a little bit, I'd say, cringe, to be honest. And so I think in our heads then, at least opening a space where we could begin thinking, okay, is this what we want, crypto to be? Is this the end of the ideas and we're just going to be pushing forward with no guidance? And then I guess opening the space then for at least people to try out new political philosophies that might be applicable to crypto.
Yeah, maybe then, Paul, since in the journal, I think the first entry, maybe, or the second entry is you give a little bit of an overview of what of where agorism came from and what it is. Could you explain a bit that story for people who maybe just like just no idea where it is, where it comes? Because it's a little bit obscure as far as like political ideologies go.
Yes, I would say this is true of everybody. Nobody knows what agorism is, so it's perfectly common. We're probably, like, up until this journal, I was probably one of the four of the people interested in it. So it emerges with a guy called Samuel Konkin III. So he died in 2004, just to give a sense of when he was active. And there isn't a lot of information about Konkin on the internet or anywhere in general. So he's a real fringe figure. In Brian O'Doherty's Radicals for Capitalism, which is basically the historical Bible of libertarianism in the United States, he appears around 3 times and only really in very brief moments and very insignificant moments. What we do know of him comes from his friend Victor Koman. So Victor Koman lived with him in what was known as the Anarcho Village, which is essentially this apartment block in California where him and other libertarians and science fiction writers hung out. So it was basically a countercultural libertarian space. He did influence some science fiction writers. So if you're interested in obscure 1980s American science literature, you will see his influence on people like Shulman, the book called Alongside Night, for example, which is an Agorism novel. But other than that, it's a very patchy online record. He does have a LinkedIn profile, funnily enough. And then in terms of his output, there's a book, New Libertarian Manifesto from 1980, which is the only book published in his lifetime. There's the Agorist Primer, which is written in 1986, but he couldn't find the publisher, and then published by his friend Victor Koman in 2008. And then there's another thing I just would call it Counter Economics from the Back Alley to the Stars, which is just a collection of different bits and pieces from his work. So it's not very systematic and it's not very well documented and he's not very well known. The person, whoever that I would compare him to in terms of his output is someone like Hakim Bey, where it's almost appealing more to a certain feeling or a certain a specific thing that he's always encouraging is the idea of, practice and activism and the distance between your theory and your kind of activity. So he's always hammering home on a single point, but he doesn't do it in a way where it feels like he's spent a lot of time constructing some elaborate system. So you're often left more with the feeling and his guilt tripping you a little bit in the distance between your practice and your theory. So in terms of how would I define it, I would say agorism is the promotion of black market activity. So the core thing you're going to find in his books is always this emphasis on black market activity. And I would even say it's a valorization of black market activity, which he also calls counter economics. And he sees this counter economics and black market activity as an expression of our truer non-statist self. So there's a connection in his work between engaging in black market activity, engaging in activity outside the state, and some way connecting you back to how you might have been if you hadn't grown up into the configuration of living in the state. So that's sort of the thing that he's promoting. So if it takes place beyond the state and it's non-violent, then Konkin is for it. So he supported people like the WTO protests in 1999. He liked the kind of anti-state activity that he saw there. The other part I would say is it's about raising the consciousness of those engaged in counter-economic activity. And by raising consciousness, again, I would say it's this idea of recognizing the legitimacy of some kind of authentic counter-economic sense, the way the indignados would call it, like live as if you're already free. So living without constraining yourself based on what the state says is like acceptable or unacceptable. And then the other element that you find in his work is this commitment to the expanding of spaces, so the expanding of autonomous zones, so temporary autonomous zones or agorist autonomous zones, you could call them. So if you're able to begin living in this counter-economic sense and you become conscious of it, your next job is to open up those spaces so other people can join in. And that's where I say a lot of the kind of crypto connection seems to be, at least for me, that crypto can be seen as a kind of counter-economic autonomous zone. Yeah, and then I mean the formal definition. This is from just a quote that I wrote down. It's the consistent integration of libertarian theory with counter-economic practice. And the agorist is one who acts consistently in freedom, for freedom and in freedom. So he basically is saying he's a libertarian if libertarians actually were consistent. So if they were genuine about living after the state, then like that's all he's adding to it. He's just saying, well, libertarianism is perfect. It's fine. I have no problem with it. He's interested in voluntarism, non-violence, pro-market, socially permissive, anti-state, anti-war. But he just sees that there's a gap between that and how people actually act. So for me, like someone like me, Konkin, I imagine, would look at and say would be a classic person who doesn't live by agorist principles. So I get paid by the government, all that kind of thing. I'm still too kind of like unable to break free of it. But then the ideals would be people like Rachel and Amir, who essentially say, well, like they're living as if they were already free. So that's, I think, what Konkin would have in mind as an agorist.
something I really like in Konkin's thought, and it's also the kind of point at which I stop agreeing with Konkin. But I think it's really important to understand. So there's something that he calls the means ends equivalence of agorism, which is like the means, which is black market activity, counter economics, is also the ends, which is a free society of consensual economic relations, existing outside coercion. So basically, by engaging in black markets, we're already creating these zones that are by definition free because they've disintermediated themselves from the state. So the end of black markets is also the means. Basically, if you engage in black market activity, you've already achieved the conditions of freedom in the way that he defines freedom. That's central to agorism, but in terms of how, I guess, where I would disagree with Konkin, or where I actually want agorism to go further, is in articulating a kind of agorist economy, which is, has more scope, goes further in scope than simply that which exists outside the state. So that that agorism begins to articulate what does a non-state economy actually look like and entail. What kind of economic relations should the non-state economy promote? And that's a little bit also one of the intentions with the journal, because as well as kind of reviving Konkin, we're also bringing new voices and new practitioners of counter economics to start defining, what is agorism today? What does agorism mean for people, and why are they practicing it, and what do they hope to achieve?
Yeah, indeed. I think with just that explanation of agorism, I think one, you can definitely tell the connection with cryptocurrencies, even if you're unaware of like the cypherpunk roots of cryptocurrency. Still, I think a lot of people probably know how like incredibly difficult, for example, it is to like report your taxes on cryptocurrency or something like that. Like there's a huge amount of like manual work, or like a lot more labor you have to do just to like, to be quote unquote legal under probably like your national jurisdiction if you want to do taxes on your cryptocurrency, for example. And I think that's sort of the reason that it shows is because I've heard my friend Morshid Manin sort of describe blockchains or cryptocurrencies as illegal, not necessarily illegal or legal, and they don't really fit neatly within the legal system, but also have properties in which it is able to easily or like fairly easily reside outside of the legal system, which of course has its own implications, and therefore like, technically that potentially means that it's like black market activity as well. Of course, when people say black market activity, though, I think maybe in what Konkin would think would be like our, I don't know, state brainwashed minds of like having lived under the states, we would think of it as necessarily being bad. But of course, maybe there is an argument to say that isn't necessarily always the case, especially if you're someone, I don't know, who like fought for legalization of marijuana or something like that, or like, someone buying weed on the corner is not like a bad thing necessarily.
So I think, Konkin in his writings, he definitely emphasizes this aspect of the black market, which is, the illegality, the non-state sanctioned activity. So activities that the state condemns, such as drugs, prostitution, these kind of activities. However, there's another sense of the black market, which, Konkin hints at when he talks about, counter economic activity and non-coercive markets, which is basically huge parts of the globe have these agoric type economic activity, which is just like normal, like working people engaging in markets without banks and without states extracting fees or taxes from those economic relations. So these are the kind of informal markets that comprise much of the Middle East and Africa and other parts of the globe. Huge portions of the globe exist in these kind of informal markets. But these are also black markets, and they define a kind of limit to the economic monopoly of like the neoliberal economic world order. So they're also the kind of frontier for Western capitalism to expand into. They want to claim those markets. So the black market has a dual sense. It's like both the zones of illegality, which are operating all over the world, like highly efficient illegal markets, and these kind of informal markets which exist outside of state oversight and tax collection.
That's interesting. Because I guess the next frontiers are of course going to be these it is currently these developing countries that are trying to be like subsumed into further financialization. But I guess here the argument is that, just to say, like, some people who would say that would also probably advocate for like it's the introduction of markets, and in the way it kind of is the introduction of markets, but it's also like the integration into like the international market. And so the black market of these places are also a type of bulwark against dependence on the international markets that we could maybe call neoliberalism or something like that. But what I found really interesting about the journal is that you guys laid out a few principles about how you want to go about publishing stuff for the journal. Because, just to know, I think what I find interesting is that a lot of this explanation for a lot of people may just sound like anarcho-capitalism. That agorism is just one form of anarcho-capitalism, that it's like a right-wing ideology. But I also find interesting that still Konkin was very critical of, like, for example, the Libertarian Party. And he, like, from what I read, he said he tried to basically destroy the Libertarian Party from the inside because he disliked it so much. And he talks about the contradictions of a lot of libertarians and what they do and what they say. So I find those interesting. And then as well, at the same time, Konkin himself places agorism as a left-wing ideology. It was a far left ideology. I'm not really exactly sure what the reasons are for that. But anyways, just to say that one of the principles that you guys laid out was that you want to include a diverse set of voices from across the political spectrum. So in the journal, you guys have people like Harry Halpin, who was on the podcast and said he was an anarchist. We had Jaya Klara Brekke, who I will hopefully have in the future, who's a socialist. And you also have Nick Land, who a lot of people will say is like very right-wing and perhaps maybe even like close to fascism. But I was wondering if you can talk about some of these like principles of your journal and like why you feel it important to follow those principles.
Okay, I will start. So one of them is just the context that we're creating this journal in, So we're writing this or compiling this journal at a time where censoring political views in academia is the standard. It's like the default of all academic institutions and publications. So that's also why the strategy that we're taking is kind of rare and unusual, because it's not often seen that you will have like these contradictory forces together in the one place. But it's also why I think that's also why we're doing it. The censorship of ideas based off of political views is very dangerous for like free and open inquiry. And many of the ideas that we take for granted today, or like the philosophies that we live in the wake of, only developed because there was a certain level of freedom of intellectual inquiry and like a diversity of political opinion. I'm thinking right now specifically of the CCRU, where Nick Land originates from in Warwick, where, we had thinkers like Nick Land working alongside thinkers like Mark Fisher, different sides of the political spectrum today. But at the time, it was all part of this open inquiry. And I think having that, so that kind of ambivalence towards the political spectrum was a very generative, very important thing that the CCRU maintained. At the same time, though, we're not, and yeah, so there's two things. The principle itself derives itself from Konkin, who himself was a kind of a journalist. A big part of his life was spent compiling these publications, much like what we've done, where he would invite various libertarian thinkers of all different descriptions to voice their opinions, oftentimes in like open conflict and contradiction. But this creates, I think, the perfect atmosphere for something like a journal, where you have voices that are not presenting some kind of single harmonious vision, but instead are trying to outline what are the different angles and approaches we can take to this idea. So Konkin achieved that, and we wanted to give the important weight to Konkin's own values by continuing that legacy. And that's important because agorism has become most closely identified with the right wing. It's such a niche ideology, but when you do find agorists, they tend to be just a subset of anarcho-capitalism. And so we wanted to draw out these other aspects to agorism that exist, like the ones that Konkin himself identified, where he would speak about Black Bloc as a potential agorist ally, and also situated agorism as far left. So we wanted to draw out these tendencies that exist already inside of agorism. And finally, when it comes to the editorial strategy, we've been discussing a little bit recently where does the line exist? So where do we draw the line? Because we're not saying like we're going to make a journal and everyone can come. We still do draw the line somewhere, and it's not everyone that will be welcomed. So what is that line? And I think in terms of Konkin, where that line should be is whether or not that person is the degree to which they are complicit or supportive of the state. So, for example, Konkin himself, he drew the line at the Libertarian Party because he said it doesn't make any sense. How can you be a libertarian and engage in party politics? It's contradiction. So that's why he hated the Libertarian Party, because he believed that as soon as you start engaging in party politics, you're already compromised. You've already been integrated into the system that you're trying
to legitimating the state in that way.
Yeah, exactly. So it's absurd. So so we would have a similar, at least, I will let Paul give his own take on this, but at least I would have a similar approach where if they're like we would try to avoid having contributors who are somehow supportive of a centralized state power.
Yeah, I think that would be a good way to frame it. So the line is almost people who are statists in some kind of way. So if their message originates in some kind of advocacy for statism, I think that would be at least one of the lines, or centralization. And I think with Nick Land, so it's very interesting for me personally to have watched this, because I can remember the old Nick Land, and Nick Land before he became this sort of scary Nick Land. So he used to be a very different character. And there's a line from Hannah Arendt who says, my PhD was on Heidegger, so this is something that's always been in my head about Nick Land, that the philosophy, it's not uncommon in philosophy for the most influential and important person to be like in some way politically ambiguous, and in some cases probably even fascist, right? That's not something uncommon. Heidegger is that figure up until Nick Land. So Heidegger is the main influence on Derrida, Levinas, etc., etc. So he's the most influential person. So Hannah Arendt said Heidegger was a philosophical genius but a political idiot. And I quite like this one. I think this is probably the same thing I'd say about Nick Land, is that there's something almost like buffoonish in the tweets. Like, let's say the more like kind of outright white nationalist tweets, they seem almost like your uncle going a bit crazy at Christmas kind of thing. It almost doesn't seem like it could be him, because it's like, and then there's also this ambiguity around like his performance and things like this. So I'm a little bit on the fence over all that kind of thing. But there is something, so I would say in Nick's work, one thing you can definitely say is there is an interest in this idea of, accelerating the breakup as much as possible of like states centralization, that's sort of the core philosophical idea that's in his work, which has then influenced a lot of philosophers down the line. So it's been influential on speculative realism, on left accelerationism, even things like luxury communism. Pretty much every contemporary philosophical movement that's at least interesting or on the edge or has pushed the narrative forward originates in Nick Land's work. So he is our perfect sort of Heideggerian, complicated kind of character. So that's why I think he's always worth publishing. You can even see on like his Twitter account the young people who are encountering Nick Land for the first time. They're both commenting on his timeline and critiquing him, and obviously fascinated as well. And I think there's something about his work that draws the attention, and I think it always goes back to this prescience that existed, that he seemed to know very early in the 1990s the trajectory of where things are going. And so he's also somebody who could potentially be pointing to philosophical changes in the future. So I think that's worth someone always worth paying attention to. If he was so good at kind of getting it back then there's the possibility that he's on the right track in terms of his predictions, not in terms of his politics.
I just want to add to that, which just to say that I completely agree with what Paul's saying. And, you know, in a way, Nick Land is like, he's a man of many masks, you know, and he's got different masks that appear at different times in different contexts. And one of the masks is actually like the mask of Nick Szabo in a way. And in this way, Nick Land has also been very influential on Bitcoin itself and the kind of metaphysics of Bitcoin in a weird way. So, like, you know, he has this text, Cryptocurrent, where he articulates this, although he alluded to these ideas in various places previously. But it's a very kind of Szaboist notion of immutable, kind of glacial, inhuman march of code, which Nick Land supports, which is the kind of, it's an absolutist vision of a perfect and permanent blockchain that's like kind of terrifying, but also, you know, has a strange kind of appeal to it. And it's this vision of blockchain which is often behind the metaphysics behind things like Bitcoin maximalism, where, you know, when you talk to Bitcoin maximalists, they start talking about the natural law and like the Bitcoin as a natural law and the unstoppable rules of Bitcoin's natural law, like 20
will like forever million, march on, like
yeah, exactly. So that's one kind of interesting mask of his. But then, you know, he also has other masks, and I think, like Paul said, like the mask that he has, which is the kind of decentralization, how does he call it, atomization, you know, is, I think, in relation to the journal, probably the most relevant thing. And we're very thankful that he gave us the text where, called Anarchy, where he applies that notion of atomization, which he had previously just spoken about in a quite an abstract philosophical way. But here he speaks very clearly about politics, which was really nice. And it also brought out some other tendencies in the other essays that we compiled. So Amy Ireland, who is also a Landian scholar, had this amazing text which we included, which resonates a lot with the Land work on this same notion of kind of atomization of politics. You know, the idea of patchwork in
I think as well, just on this, one of the like more startling things about Nick's work. So I wrote this thing called The Vitalist Disjuncture Between Process, Organization Studies and Accelerationism for some business journal. And
for a business journal.
Yeah. So they're interested in it a little bit as well. So that business journals are behind by about 10 years. So, you know, they're always catching up. And so trying to get across to them about, so one of the hardest thing about Nick Land's work to get across to people is that he has sided not on the human. Like, he has made a decision that he is on the side of some kind of self-organizing, self-constructing artificial intelligence. It's pure esoteric metaphysics. If you can follow that line with him, then it's like really cool and really interesting. But it does require you to basically say like the humans are not important. I think he's probably the only person who's really followed that logic, as hardcore as anybody else.
Yeah, indeed. I mean, I would say that like a lot of people to me have well, I get like two senses of like opinions about Nick Land. One is like, oh, stay the fuck away. It's like really weird. And then the other side is sort of like, well, no, if you like read a little bit into it and like just like give it have the intellectual inquiry, then like there are some things to take away from it. Which of course, like I mean, just to be perfectly frank, I did read Nick Land's essay in the Agorist journal. It was a bit difficult for me to read personally. It was not an easy one. I'm not really sure if I got everything right, but it was like, I don't know. I in general, I do respect at least the principles of like bringing these different like political tendencies together and sort of like not thinking about political divisions like first and foremost, or like at the first thing that you talk about, for example. Because of, I mean, like the examples like the CCRU, like plenty of amazing things came out of the CCRU. You can't like argue against that. And they were not like super concerned about politics. Of course, politics became something a bit afterwards. But it was only after this sort of confluence of different ideas and thinkers that came together. But just to say, like the principles that you guys lined out, just have the journal here, are to reject political divisions, welcome dissonance, and no compromises, which I think with the selection of people that you have, I think that's definitely the case for this first publication. So if you've talked about this a little bit, this idea of counter economics from Konkin. Could you explain a little bit more what counter economics is, besides maybe like black market stuff? Because I think, or just like trade outside of the state. Because I've also read, for example, like if we think about it from if we set aside the anarcho-capitalist like thinking around this type of thing, one of the things that makes me wonder is whether something like mutual aid counts as counter economics, or like, to help people, especially like my audience, to think about like a left-wing idea of a black market, or like, because I think sometimes there is this tendency that, in my opinion, comes from liberals mostly, that the banking system is better than cryptocurrency because it's like good, regulated, under the state type of ideas, and that because there is this supposedly benign regulation from the state over these giant financial companies, then it's a good thing, and that crypto is bad because it's like outside of the states. But I think it's, for me at least, clear that a lot of activism happens outside of the state, and we also consider it good. We just don't think about it in maybe like this counter economic lens.
Yeah. So one of the motivations for me with say Konkin's work is that in his, let's say, his patchwork, not very super well developed like philosophy, in as much as it is a philosophy, and as I was arguing earlier, I'd say it's more of a like more like he's promoting an attitude or a feeling, and then he doesn't really give you a very clear picture of how things are going to develop. Now he does have this set of phases, which are very science fiction-y, right? So it's very similar to how a science fiction author might imagine the society developing. So it goes from phase zero density agora society, which is more or less just like the situation as he encountered it. So trying to find those people who are engaged in counter-economic activity, and then giving them some libertarian theory, and then I guess radicalizing them. And then phase one, low density agora society. This is where we get the idea of the new libertarian alliances, or sometimes it's new, like he gives that L can be libertarian, sometimes it can be left as well. And these are organizations which gather together to complete some kind of task, and then they disband. But really, what they're always trying to do is try to show people, how a counter economic life is more attractive. So I guess in the case of crypto, something like a DAO or DeFi where there's some incentive which attracts you over to, let's say, activity happening outside of the traditional financial formalized institutions, and you're pulling people over through that sort of activity. And then he goes from that very quickly to phase 3, high density condensation Agora society, and Agora society with status impurities, where he doesn't explain what's happening in there except to say that the previously contiguous territory of the state has been slowly eaten away by these emerging mini spatial zones, which have become more attractive, and people have become they've become sympathetic. And he doesn't explain why they've become sympathetic. It's just they have. So he leaves this ambiguous. And I think what I'd say one of the goals of the journal is to begin that process of articulating what exactly would these societies look like. Now, my position on this is that cryptocurrency essentially is the economic financial version of this. Like, it's already happening. So we have that sort of example. But I think, at least in the case of me and Rachel, and different Agorists, people might have an idea of this, we would like to see more of a mutualist direction. So we are going to have to articulate that idea of what the mutualist position would be. I think probably for both of us, it's probably something like Rojava. It's probably democratic confederalism is the model. So this is the other thing about this kind of politics, where you can, I guess in a way, where we are trying to promote the idea that agorism or counter economics already exists. It's just that they're maybe not exactly known as that. So I'll hand back to Rachel.
Yeah, thanks, Paul. And definitely agree. Like, I think mutual aid is a good example of counter economics. Like, definitionally, it's very loose. So it's any kind of activity that exists outside the state. And all that means is like any kind of economic activity where you're not declaring that activity to the state. So you could say that now, with the growth of financial surveillance, the kind of space of economic counter economics is getting smaller, or at least that it's migrated away from the fiat system towards the crypto system. So you could say that instead, like, if the state is surveilling all your transactions in fiat, maybe it's impossible to have fiat counter economics. But instead, there's like many possibilities for counter economics in crypto, including mutual aid, including, all these various airdrops. And I mean, to be honest, most of it, anything, as long as it's not people declaring taxes, is definitionally counter economics. But then, we come back to something I touched on, and what Paul just said, when he mentioned Rojava, is like, there's this, how to say, no, I don't want to say blind spot, or there's just a lack of information from Konkin on like what is the kind of post-state society economy, but he tells us like as soon as you stop paying taxes and stop doing like state sanctioned activity, you're already in the post-state society. You've like made that transition. However, I had this discussion with a friend yesterday who was saying, but even if he said, I'm an agorist in a way, like I've never had a bank account. All my financial activity is cash based, and I don't have any ID. So like I'm an agorist according to Agorism. But he said, I'm still not free. Like I don't feel any more free on account of, and we came to the conclusion after discussing it that, okay, he hasn't achieved like the state of like perfect freedom, because he's still within the state-based society, and he has the same behaviors, ultimately as someone who does pay tax or uses a bank account. He has the same set of consumer behaviors. But he has achieved some kind of a small freedom. It's like slightly better than having like a fully state-sanctioned activity. So then, the kind of idea of what happens next, like to really develop the non-state economics, that's where we have to look to thinkers like, for example, Öcalan, who is in some ways very compatible with Konkin, I wrote an article. It still hasn't been published, but maybe it will get published at some point, where I looked at the kind of similarities between Konkin and Öcalan, and they both have similar language when they describe the state, which is a language very common to. I mean, they share a lot of roots, like libertarianism, but then they're very different contemporary forms. But they talk about the state as a kind of vampire, which is like parasitic. It sits on top of like the people and free society, and it extracts all of the creative activity and all of the bounty produced by the free society in order to sustain itself, like a parasite. And also for Öcalan, he basically says we need to remove this parasite in order to liberate like the free society, which in Öcalan's view is something which has always existed since even before the emergence of the state in ancient Sumer, and it's kind of still existing throughout history. There's like different ebbs and flows where the free society rises up and gains dominance in small kind of patches, and then it fades away again. So there's this kind of constant war between the state and free society, and his job is to or Öcalan, his intention is to do a kind of archaeology of the free society to find out where it is and like what it is, and how can we uncover it from the ruins of state-based society and give voice to it again, or to give it form. So that's Öcalan's goal, and I see it as highly compatible with Konkin's, because Konkin has almost exactly the same language when he describes. He also talks about the free society as something that exists inside the state-based society, but that the state-based society is like extracting all of this value from it. So counter economics is how do we essentially liberate free society from state-based society, and Konkin's proposal is we do it by not paying taxes. At least that's the first step. For Konkin, that's the black market. The counter economics is like a tactic, but because of the means ends equivalence, it's also the kind of final form of the society he's proposing.
Yeah, I think they share an image which is common to a few people on those lines. Murray Bookchin would be another person who's quite influential on Öcalan, of course. They all have this similar language of internalization and trying to re-recognize yourself or uncover yourself. I think is really like that. I like that idea of the archaeology of like pre-state societies. But I just wanted to mention on this mutualism thing, at least one of the attractions, I think, is that there is an opportunity in the sort of ambiguity of Ethereum's politics in particular at the moment. So I'm quite interested in this idea that Ethereum does have some politics, or there are people vying for Ethereum's politics. Let's say it's going DAO up, Solarpunk being the one that's popular at the moment. And I think at least personally, I see myself, or see the potential here of introducing more mutualist ideas into Ethereum culture is at least partially a motivation for the journal, because with Bitcoin, the politics are very solidified. They're sort of done. They're cemented. They're evolving. They're evolving in a way where it's like they've evolved the worst tendencies of like the previous stuff, so they have changed, but only by extracting the worst. And I think in Ethereum, it's the opposite situation where we can use this to introduce those mutualist ideas. I also think that the transition that Konkin talks about, where you go up against the state and you have this transition, requires a mutualist approach. So this is something you'll hear from, let's say, preppers. So the prepper who starts out looks after themselves, right? So they collect guns, they collect cans and stuff, and they're like holed up in somewhere and they're on their own. And then when the disaster happens, they lose, right? Because they're basically, they've got nobody to rely on. And so I think in a more realistic, realpolitik version of Konkin's work, it does have an explanation of mutual aid as a defense against the state, because there's no way you're going to survive that contact unless you're operating as a group in some kind of way.
Yeah, I do find it interesting how the prepper community definitely does tend to be a little bit more like conservative or right wing, thinking that the state is going to implode at some point for one reason or another, and then it's going to be a free for all. But yeah, indeed, I think the only way really, if that were to happen, your best chance of survival is like having just networks of mutual aid, or like people you can count on, like having this social safety nets. Whether, I mean, in the case where theoretically the state disappears, then your social safety net is sort of brought to you by your peers or those around you in your community and so forth, which seems to be just like totally lost in these people. I don't know how. Their shotgun's going to protect them. So I'm curious now that you guys have just published the journal. Is there any like learnings since you've published it? I know it's only been like a couple of weeks, but like what kind of like response you've been getting, and like what do you think? Yeah, what kind of learnings have you gotten out of it?
I think the response so far has been really great. I'm really happy with it. So far, everyone has been very receptive. There hasn't been, some kind of major controversy over the idea to include, diversity of political opinion. It seems like that's been accepted as a strategy. So I think that's really positive for us, but also like a nice reflection on the crypto community as well. And so far it's been great. I think if I was to change one thing, and something that we will change now coming up to the second issue, is to make it longer, have more submissions. But no, I think it was a great start, and I'm excited. I'm excited to do more.
Yeah, I think what I took from it is that based on those like messages people have sent on Twitter or wherever, is there is an appetite for something like this, appetite for some kind of political journal with it's not fully focused on cryptocurrency, but that's obviously a big theme of it. And a lot of the messages I got were focused on the idea that there hasn't been a real serious attempt to reflect on the trajectory of crypto for a little bit of a little while. Um, Probably the other thing might be just maybe more thematic. I think might be an interesting approach. So I think next time we might be doing, say, like a solar punk, Lunarpunk type approach, or something to tie it together, so that each issue maybe could generate some kind of wider discussion that people could follow.
Nice. Yeah, I'm really looking forward to the next issues. But I completely agree with what you were saying, Paul, that there seems to be this, which is like, it's common in like a lot of places, but like this desire for things to be apolitical, or like for crypto especially to be apolitical, as if there is, we're just like collecting tokens and like having fun. There's no politics here. Get away from me, government. Like all of this is just like very, very political inherently, especially with this technology that is so innovative, which has like so many implications that are so different from as if you were going to, I don't know, use the normal financial rails. You instead decide to use some sort of cryptocurrency to like do one thing or another, which is like part of the reason why I also recently published my my article, like synthesizing DAOs and anarcho-syndicalism, and I made the same observation that there is a bit of this like apolitical do-gooderism sort of like in Ethereum, especially in like this public goods like solar punk space, which, I mean, we were talking about this earlier, but like there are some, let's say, naiveties, or like sort of utopian thinking in the bad sense of utopian, let's say short-sightedness, that I think we can kind of see coming, and starting to think about the political implications now rather than later will probably will help in this, making sense of all the craziness that is like hypothetically potentially going to come, if especially if Konkin is correct, and we have this degradation of the state and people going more and more into black markets or something like that.
Just on that, I think that's sort of like the perfect example of the naivety a little bit. So in the Ethereum political philosophy article that I wrote, I tried to emphasize that you could read Ethereum as engaged in decentralized analogs to state functions. So taking like previous things that the state used to do, and then like offering examples. So that could be like DeFi finance, NFT, like replacing kind of like state artistic institutions, and then DAOs as the organizational form. And public goods, what's interesting about them is there are groups like running headlong into providing public goods, and eventually this will, I imagine, expand out into the real world. In which case, they're basically saying to the state that we can do this better than you, and say once you start doing that, that's when you're really going to get the state kind of looking at your activities. So I think there's a little bit of a naivety about let's just take things that states have done, and the state is not going to be interested in our activities.
Yeah, I think that's a good analysis. And connected to what you were saying, this idea of like apolitical do-gooderism, I find this like appalling, and I think that's probably the line that we'd want to draw, like when it comes to the journal. It's the kind of statist, because that is a statist position, in a way. It's like especially because this idea of good often comes from a kind of statist definition of ethics, like stuff like, oh, if it's black market, it's bad, and if it's state sanctioned, it's good. So I definitely agree with you on that. And also when it comes to solarpunk, there's a lot of naivety. I wrote this article for eGirl Capital called
I highly recommend.
Thank you. It's called Lunarpunk and the Dark Side of the Cycle. And I'm criticizing solarpunk in there for the exact same reason, like this naivety, this lack of realism when it comes to the interaction of crypto and the state. Because I basically argue that, like, as all of the stuff happening on Ethereum is now happening in ClearNet, like transparent plain text, it means that if there is ever some kind of conflict with the state, or if there's any kind of, illegality of crypto that happens, the people who engage in crypto, the users, are going to be the first ones to go, because they're the ones which are going to be liable for using the networks. So I think there's too much of an emphasis on censorship resistance at the level of the nodes, and not enough emphasis on like making the users have that same level of censorship resistance, which only comes through like anonymity and privacy, in terms of their usage of the network. Otherwise, they could be like legally liable, and you can't have a network that's not a anti-fragile network if your users are under threat like that. And I think that the reason why this naivety exists, it comes from the fact that many people in Ethereum are these kind of statist do-gooders, which see themselves as on the side of the law. And they often come from Western countries where, they've never had to deal with persecution or, having their transactions censored, because they've always been on the right side of the law, and they've always been protected by the law. So they don't see that, it's hard for them to see that there could be a different, that they could be under threat, or that their users could be under threat. So I think that's a massive oversight.
And it's becoming super relevant, I think, because of, you've probably seen recently, I think like OpenSea is going to stop catering to like Iranians or something. They're also going to stop catering to like Venezuelans, like different, maybe it was even MetaMask that said they weren't going to. So like all of these things are popping up now. All of a sudden, I think probably in relation to the sanctions on Russia, maybe like now they're taking it more seriously, that, okay, maybe we need to adhere to the US's economic sanctions because of this and that, and we don't want to. So like I think there's this need, because they are also legally incorporated companies, like they have this pressure, like pretty immense pressure to follow the law of the United States, or that they need to, so that they can continue to exist, so they can continue to make profits. So like it's like really, to me, it's like a huge example and like clear thing that like the state is pretty necessary for capitalism to function in the way that it's functioning right now. So like, I guess this form of capitalism, whatever you want to call it. And it's sort of, it's not like, I guess I'm also like skeptical of some people's views of like, no, we just need to have this sort of like just take over of the states and then make it good type of approach. because we're seeing sort of like all these things happening.
I just want to add in a little bit here about like solar punk and Lunarpunk, because like this is something me and Rachel have talked about quite a bit. But I'm a little bit softer on like solar punk. By solar punk, I mean the one before this sort of liberal version of it. There used to be a more anarchist, interesting, I would say, even like
Well, I'd say that
libertarian.
there still exists this solar punk subculture in like anarchist circles that I think is sort of ambivalent towards this use of solar punk in like places like Ethereum is what I can kind of see.
Yeah, and I quite like that. I was interested in solar punk for a long time before it started like sneak. I don't know where it came from or how it evolved into Ethereum, but like seeing it sort of morph was something a little bit disheartening for me. And I kind of do like the solar punk vision in the sense of if you presented like that vision of society to most people of a highly technologically advanced but also like green, society, like a lot of people would be like, yes, that is the society that we should strive for. So I do think there's something in that, the kind of gap between like what you see in a solar punk image versus our current societies. I do like that contrast that it forces between like here and now. At the same time, I do think if there was to be something like a solar punk political philosophy, that it would require a defense of sorts, some sort of like lunar punk contingent who are like more real politics serious, who are defending it. So the way I've taught of this is that like solar punk without lunar punk is maybe weak or not able to defend itself against the state. But like lunar punk without solar punk would be like too hard. It needs like some kind of like solar punk, aspect to it as well. So I do think there's like some possibility of rescuing solar punk, but it might be lost. But I do sort of like the images, I must admit.
Well, one possible like strategy for the solar punks is like how do you how do you bring out those more radical aspects that exist in like the Ethereum solar punk imaginary, while also kind of like pushing back those like more sinister forms of solar punk, like the more liberal variants, which involve like total surveillance infrastructures and that kind of thing. So I think that would be a really valuable goal, and something that the journal will be very interested in achieving is like speaking to solar punks and radicalizing them essentially, which brings us back to like why did the journal kind of come into being in the first place. And one of the things that we discussed in the early days was that there was this kind of, in Ethereum especially, this kind of lack of political motivation or like motive, that maybe there was a lack of ideological leadership where there's a lot of people who felt galvanized into crypto, usually because of these exciting political ideas, like let's take on the banks and stuff. But then when they got there, they're like, oh, what is this? We're just like, as you said, collecting tokens. And so there's a kind of this meandering kind of lost sense, like in some of the branches of Ethereum. So that's also what we want to speak to, and like there has been these more since the last few years. There has been some new ideologies emerging. Solarpunk is one of them. It has these liberal tendencies, it has these anarchist tendencies. So we want to, with the journal, bring those more radical tendencies out and kind of show those followers of solarpunk why the other ideas are very dangerous. So basically, we intend to radicalize them if possible.
Yeah, for sure. I wish you a lot of luck in that radicalization attempt. At the moment, I recently also talked to some people in the crypto leftist community that I have. They went to East Denver, and yeah, they had some interesting thoughts about like what they saw. I mean, what at like Shelling Point and like East Denver and this stuff, that there wasn't enough self-reflection, I guess, on what they were doing, or like really critical thoughts on like whether or not what they were doing was like a good idea, or whether it like actually answered the actual problem in certain ways. It was really interesting when I spoke to them. But one of the things that it seems to be is that there's almost this idea, especially in Ethereum, but also in a lot of other places, that like we can make a lot of money and do good at the same time, which kind of personally I'm a little I'm very skeptical of. If you're in that type of thinking as like it feels more like a self-justification, that if I'm using like it's like justifying that I'm interested in this technology and making a lot of money, therefore surely I must be doing good.
There should be some kind of fallacy for that, like some kind of nice logical fallacy for, where you believe there's an association or correlation between how much money you're making and like how good you're contributing.
Which is very, very neoliberal, like type of thing.
There's an issue because I think in a lot of like world religions, there's like an overlap. Like if you're making money, you're like seen as good. Protestantism has this. It's like
especially
you're like, yeah, you're showing that you're kind of economically chosen by God, and Islam also has this like, that wealth is good. It's like God's abundance. You should acquire it. Um, so like what you're saying might make sense to those religious beliefs. I also wanted to mention in crypto, there's like there are these kind of normalizing or like normative forces that are very deep in crypto, and I think partially why so much of the communities have this kind of this lack of political motive, where they're a bit like meandering and lost, is it's not by accident. Like I think it's a lot to do with where is the money in crypto coming from, and some amount or like a non insignificant amount of the money is coming from these kind of huge regulated financial entities, which are financing a lot of projects. And they have this kind of a pressure. They apply these kind of pressure to projects when they're funding them, to like, to make their image, their aesthetic be as kind of safe as possible, because they want to appeal to like the mainstream audience. So that means like, don't be too scary in your like political objectives, like keep it light and keep it friendly and open. It's kind of a
PG.
marketing tactic. Yeah, exactly. And appeal to like the greatest common denominator, and the idea is as soon as you start expressing a political position, or even like an aesthetics which deviates from like the norm, you may be like making your audience smaller. So there's this kind of pressure from a lot of the kind of VC funds, and on the one hand, it's the marketing. I think it's like a legitimate kind of marketing tactic, not necessarily a successful one, but like a legitimate kind of recognized one. But on the other hand, I also think that a lot of these high level hedge funds and stuff, they're taking money effectively from the state. Like when you go back far enough, like the money that they're allocated is money that comes from like the very centralized forces that we're trying to critique, whether it be like centralized governments or like indirectly through the centralized bank, the central bank. So I think they're compromised in that their bottom line depends on the perpetuation of like the current system of states and banks and so on. So there's a kind of that kind of tension exists inside of crypto itself.
It's like it's the same problem. I mean, in crypto or not in crypto, like when you accept VC money or something like that, there are always strings attached to it, and it's part of the difficulty why things, just another somewhat related thing, or like platform cooperatives are like difficult to fund because they don't want to adhere to like the stipulations of venture capital, for example. Yeah, and at the same time, these venture capital firms have a very big interest in looking good in front of the state.
Yeah, and I think one of the kind of like sad things about it is you have a situation where a group of people have essentially created the conditions where, like, more or less they could sever the dependency relation from venture capitalism because they have enough, but the VC money obviously, pushes things to a new level. But let's say they were like a good old fashioned co-op, they would really struggle to have any money at all. It would be a constant struggle to make things happen. But you have these groups of people who do have money, have a respectable amount of money to get by, but nonetheless kind of compromise themselves by getting mixed up with the venture capital. And I've always found that the most disappointing thing. I would say in general, DeFi for me has been like the whole trajectory of it so far has been very disappointing because there's an almost a self-imposed part as well. So let's say the venture capitalism hasn't been what's ruined this project. The most likely next candidate is a self-imposed nihilism, a sort of the hentai, like we're just like not really into anything. Ponzi-nomics, this term of like, well, the old system was a Ponzi, we're going to create our own self-organized Ponzi, which of course inevitably crashes. So that's another thing that can happen as well, I think. So yeah, I mean like something like DeFi should be the vanguard. It should be, I mean, I think that's what DarkFi is doing, but generally speaking, DeFi's apolitical nature is a major disappointment because that should be what's challenging central banks and the financial system as it stands.
Speaking about crypto and politics, Rose, I know that you are a part of Assange DAO, which is like part of this effort to use cryptocurrency and DAOs and everything around it to sort of help with with all the issues around Julian Assange. Could you speak briefly maybe about what that is and the current status of that?
Yeah, sure. So like the DAO is called Assange DAO, and the goal of the DAO is the liberation of Assange. This is a goal that like so far we've the major kind of thing we did was we raised a lot of money to bid on the PAC NFT, which is called Clock. So I think it was about a month ago now, we raised over 50 million for this NFT, which we then bid on the NFT. And that's money which is now being sent to the Val Holland Foundation, which is a non-profit, which is the kind of the way that Julian Assange is going to pay for his legal fees. So we managed to ship 50 million toward Julian's defense, with the goal of, which is a huge amount of money. Yeah, it's amazing. Now though, like we're kind of, we have the aftermath of that. There's a lot of, DAOs are, like the nature of DAOs is that you have many different participants, and they have different views about how to do things. And, it can be, hard enough to operate collectively with people in a physical space when you're talking eye to eye. But, with a DAO, it can be even harder because you got like, you never met each other before, there's no like real trust basis. So things can get like, it's just a very different kind of form of collaboration. So one of the major kind of conflicts we had was, this question of the max bid. That's like, do you give all the money to the NFT or not? And there is some voices like in the community which wanted to keep some amount of capital in the DAO in order to use that capital to free Assange by other means than the legal system. So that was kind of interesting, and then we see this, like there's a kind of interesting. The consequence of that was that the kind of 50 million that was transferred from the DAO to the traditional foundation was kind of like a $50 million bet on the supremacy of traditional institutions with respect to DAOs. So that was kind of a shock, I think, and the community is still recovering from that decision, which was very contentious. But there are still like a lot of community members and a lot of interest in the kind of two goals, which is like, free Assange, but also like now look after this, huge community of token holders who want to engage with the DAO and kind of shepherd them. So in terms of my own involvement, like I've basically retreated since the max bid. And I've been focused primarily on building anonymous DAOs on DarkFi, because our plan is to basically port over the Assange DAO community into DarkFi, so it can pursue goals like freeing Assange in a way that's like properly censorship resistant and like safe for users, instead of on ETH where everything is surveilled, and even participating in a DAO like the Assange DAO could be a legal risk for some people.
Right. I guess this is like directly sort of the criticism that you were making earlier, sort of like the Lunarpunk argument that you put forth earlier.
Yeah.
Basically playing out in real life.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah.
That's what I'm saying. I just want to talk about, because I think it was interesting because at least in my view, the story of WikiLeaks and the story of Bitcoin are sort of are very, very close. You can't really separate them very easily. And it is like it's like the story to tell, I think, when you're talking about the politics of cryptocurrency, because you can't really take that apart. And I think it's sort of, in my view, it sort of counters this really common narrative on some people, especially on the left, who say that like Bitcoin or cryptocurrency is only a libertarian thing, like specifically a right-wing libertarian thing. But at the same time, like they wouldn't say that WikiLeaks is a right-wing libertarian thing either, but it was sort of like pretty essential to the development of Bitcoin and the growth of Bitcoin.
Yeah.
So it is interesting that now, some like 10 plus years later, we're sort of like back at the point, or like the same issue again, that still hasn't been resolved. And sort of now we're using the new tools at this space that has been created thanks to Julian Assange, trying to use it to now, continue his efforts and to fucking let him go finally.
Yeah, Paul actually, one of the days around the time of the auction, evoked a very beautiful quote when we were speaking with each other, which was he referred to the hornet's nest. I believe you referred to the DAO as the hornet's nest, and the significance of this phrase is, one of the final posts that Satoshi made on the Bitcoin forum was a comment in response to an article where WikiLeaks was using Bitcoin, and Satoshi replied, "WikiLeaks has kicked the hornet's nest, and the storm is headed towards us." And that was either like his second last or his final post on the Bitcoin forum. So there's a kind of question as to whether that was the point in which he left the project. Is he like, oh shit, this has gotten a bit hot and, I'm out kind of thing? Could have been. But yeah, I agree. It's kind of come full circle. We have the new kind of hornet's nest is the Assange DAO. Go on, Paul.
I said we're the hornet's nest now.
Yeah.
So it's switched around, and that story that kind of I think, even though it's kind of awkward because it is the second last post, it would be cooler if it was the last one, and that sort of basically makes Satoshi disappear, or is the most likely cause. When I'm teaching crypto with my students, another thing that you'll say with this, let's say the basic stories that you tell newcomers to crypto will always be the pizza, right? So 10,000 Bitcoins by Laszlo. And I often say to the students, it's like, well, actually the first real use case for Bitcoin wasn't that. That was just a isolated, like not all that significant event. It was the WikiLeaks donation. That's what had many, many people using Bitcoin in a very serious, recognizable way. So for me, like that is the first use case of Bitcoin in any kind of sustained, consistent way. So, and it's beautiful that it's gone full circle. So the way the hornet's nest is switched.
Yeah, it is that, and maybe you could also argue Silk Road as well, which I guess you can also say is, the guy I think was like very influenced by Agorism you mentioned.
Yeah, by Konkin, yeah.
Yeah. It's important we talk about Ross, because the Free Ross DAO was also the inspiration for the Assange DAO. Like we'd been, a few of us, in conversation with Assange's brother Gabriel for some months. I think he's been speaking with Amir for literally years, trying to strategize about ways to ship some money to the Assange case. And it wasn't until the Free Ross DAO that we realized that, this kind of thing is possible. And we made the Assange DAO. But Ross Ross Ulbricht, the creator of the Silk Road, super influential figure within crypto, a kind of saintly figure, you know, like one of crypto's martyrs, in the same way as Assange is. And in the early days, like before the Silk Road was shut down, so I guess like 2013, Ross used to publish manifestos on the front page of the Silk Road, where he would talk about agorism, agorist ideas, and he made the Silk Road because, you know, he discovered the philosophy of agorism, and he felt like, wow, let's do this. We have the tools now. You know, we can make the unstoppable black market that Konkin wrote about. So you know, that's what he did. And there's a beautiful, I would point everyone to there's a beautiful article on Forbes, which is the collected quotations of Dread Pirate Roberts, which is extracts from a lot of his manifestos published on the Silk Road under the pseudonym Dread Pirate Roberts. I'd highly recommend those texts. They're really beautiful, and they explain a lot about agorism in practice.
Yeah, and in Konkin's work, there is direct descriptions of darknet, like what look very close to darknet marketplaces. So he talks about encryption. He talks about what would it be like in the future where we were able to, as he says, lick the information problem. So how could we make it so that like people's identities were hidden and all that kind of thing. So he was very prescient in lots of ways on this. And that description of darknet markets, I think it's in the Agorism primer, it had to have been, I think, the main thing that Ulbricht was thinking of, because he explicitly says that he was influenced by Konkin's work. And in that book, you just had this little description of some kind of anonymous marketplace where the state aren't able to kind of catch people's transactions. So also the other weird thing is that they were both into chemistry. They both studied chemistry to an advanced degree. I haven't made the connection. Why is it that these two figures? But I always thought that was sort of weird. But yeah, he was directly influenced by it. So there is a line between Konkin and Ulbricht.
Interesting, yeah. Maybe it's this like the idea of like chemical reaction, where if certain conditions come about, then explosion of new things. I don't know. Yeah, I mean, I think the story of Ross Ulbricht, I don't know. Sometimes I go back and forth on it, to be perfectly honest. Like I don't know, not to like pick one or the other, but I generally like the story of Assange a little bit nice. It's easier to justify than I think Ross Ulbricht is yet at the moment. But also, I think I need to read more about the Ross Ulbricht story, because I've heard like conflicting things a lot of the time.
Yeah, I would recommend his texts, the manifestos that he published. But I agree with you. Like Julian Assange is much more openly a political project, whereas with Ross it's a bit more. It's a bit more obscure, and there's also the fact that all of these posts that he made, the political posts, were done under the pseudonym, which that is what links him to the Silk Road. So there's still kind of like legal issues about like talking about him in relation to those pseudonyms and stuff, and as well, I actually we wrote to Ross to invite him to the Journal. And he replied, and he said that he wouldn't advise anyone to speak about agorism publicly. So Ross now, yeah, he's kind of repented. And if you listen to his speech that he gave to the Bitcoin, I think it was Bitcoin Miami last year, very beautiful but very like emotional speech. He apologizes to the crypto community. He says, maybe it would have been easier for you guys if I didn't do the Silk Road, which, it's not clear if he's saying that because he wants to get out of prison, or if he genuinely believes it, or if it's kind of both. I think it's probably a bit of both. They're like the same, mixed up with each other. But he's kind of he's given up the radical message for now.
There's an interesting image that always stuck in my head about this. It's in one of the Silk Road documentaries, and someone says Ross Ulbricht is like, we're all in a film, and we're like in a line, and in this film, like there's like guys shooting at us from the door, but someone has to go through the door first to be brave. And he says Ross was first through the door. Like he was just sort of the person who happened to be in the firing line, and so he took the brunt of pretty much everything. And his story, if you investigate it, I would say it's a good example of somebody being slowly corrupted by the influences around him. So he starts off with Silk Road, with that, Forbes, really kind of interesting, clear-cut analysis of what he believes he's doing, trying to create non-violent methods by which people can, buy and sell drugs, because he didn't consider drugs to be like violence because you took it yourself, all that kind of thing. But the people around him, especially Roger Thomas Clark, who's currently on trial, he's like the number two. Like these guys had been active in drug markets since the 1990s and the 2000s, and were pretty famous for basically being like just like kind of psychologically messing with people, so they would plant drugs on each other, all kinds of stuff. And they slowly kind of turned Ross toward all that assassination stuff. That doesn't really come from him. It comes from the people who basically took advantage of his idealism. So I would say his story, it's like a perfect story of someone starts out pure and then slowly around him has accumulated the worst kind of people you could imagine.
Yeah, I can imagine. Wow, that's interesting. I'll read more into it. Yeah, maybe just to finish it off. I mean, first off, thank you guys for coming on and sharing what agorism is in the first place. All these things about with Assange DAO. I wish you like the best of luck in radicalizing these people. We're all trying to do it here, I think. But maybe just end it off. Could you just share with people where they could find the journal? I'll of course put links to it in the show notes so people can click on the link and read it there. And where people can keep up with you guys.
Sure. So we have a website, which is agorist.xyz. You can also follow us on Twitter. I believe the handle is agorism XXI as the Roman numerals, 21st century. And, I also have a Twitter. My handle is lunar mining. You can also follow our work on DarkFi at dark.fi. And I think that's it.
Yeah, I'm a Polar Punk Labs, formerly Solar Punk Labs, but have since had to change.
You're gonna have to explain what Polar Punk is now and how it differs from solar and lunar.
Yeah, I just kind of wanted one that was like somewhere in between like the sun and the moon. So I was like, all right, I'll call it Polar Punk Labs. Well, in terms of just like it's a little bit. Maybe you can think of it as like a kind of colder solar punk is maybe what I'm going for. The other thing I want to say, if people have like interesting areas that we don't know about and they could like write to us or people that we should be looking at, or, that would also be pretty cool because we obviously don't see everything. So maybe people think that there should be some positions that aren't represented to suggest them.
Amazing.
Yeah, for sure. I can give you guys a couple of recommendations of people that I would love to see write in this type of journal.
Please do. Yeah.
All right. Thank you guys so much.
Thank you.